Alright everybody, welcome to the third video lecture. My apologies for the last minute in that last video. I think I fixed the problem in a way that'll work. For now, what I wanted to do is highlight some learning objectives for this particular case. 3 in particular, the first of which is the idea that innovation is a system. As I was explaining to you, you can't just talk about management, culture, development process, or organization alone, but recognize their interdependencies. Second is this idea that if you want to be innovative, you've got to be ready to experiment. That's a critical activity to product development and system change. Lastly, IDEO uses prototyping as its mechanism for carrying out experiments. So it uses the prototypes as straw men that can be knocked down, and each prototype represents an opportunity to gain data about what works and what doesn't. If you remember, the case notes that a picture is worth 1,000 words. For them, a prototype is worth 10,000. So with that in mind, what I want to show you is the decision. And to be sure, I'm not going to write in my ideas because unfortunately the computer's not letting me do that. However, if you notice, the decision is as follows. Number 1, the IDEO can accept the Visor product as is on the dramatically reduced schedule. Second, IDEO can try to persuade Handspring to change its aggressive schedule to mirror its traditional development cycle, which, as you know, is much longer. And then lastly, it can flat out opt to decline the project. And there are pros and cons to each one of those. I usually get a handful of people who choose 1 or 3, but most people in the class opt for 2. So the way we would typically have a class discussion around it is to have somebody give reasons to decline the project. Excuse me. And you could argue that there are a handful of those pretty readily. For one, there's a conflict of interest, arguably, in that IDEO is already representing the folks who are developing the Palm Pilot, and now they are trying to represent Handspring, which would be kind of a cheaper knockoff, so to speak. So is that a conflict of interest that should prevent them from taking the project altogether? Is a question. Second is the idea that taking the project requires some degree of secrecy among the people who are part of the project, and that could undermine the openness of culture that IDEO has created. Next is the idea that they just don't need the business. Why do they need it? And so maybe this really isn't the kind of opportunity that they want because it's cheaper, it's a knockoff. It's not truly as innovative as their transformative, revolutionary processes designed to create, so to speak. So they could opt to flat out decline the project. On the flip side, they could try to do it on the dramatically reduced time schedule. And there are again some reasons to do that, including the idea that client is king. This is what Handspring has actually asked for. It may well be that the Visor is the new product standard, and they need to get that out before the holiday season. Another one is that because they're using some tried and true technology, that maybe they don't need a lot of that upfront innovative process that they usually employ. Lastly, and one of the stronger arguments, is the idea that IDEO could use the dramatically reduced time schedule as an opportunity to experiment with its own development process. The idea being, hey, maybe they can truncate the usual time schedule and be faster than they usually are if they try to experiment with the system. Again, most people opt to try to persuade Handspring to change its aggressive schedule, and they do so on the basis of things like the fact that this is what Handspring's good at. It's good based on this normal time schedule. It needs to educate the client. It would be sacrificing its actual process and may lead to a poor product, among other things. I'm going to pause this for a second. My daughter is crying upstairs. Let me go see how she's doing. All right, I'm going to hope for the best here. The system itself, I want you to note this. if you think about IDEO as a funnel, with the front end of the funnel, that is the top of the funnel, as a metaphor, the idea is that a lot of ideas are developed in the front end, which go through the process leading to the back end of the funnel where one idea is chosen. So you want to ask yourself at the onset, where is IDEO's competitive advantage? And it's pretty clear that it is in the front end of the funnel with this customer anthropology that they do, the rich deep dive in terms of brainstorming, and real attempt to understand what the customer's needs are. The back end of the funnel really is that part where you're creating the technical designs and manufacturing this product so that you can offload it to the company that hired you. And arguably, many firms are out there that do it. So the uniqueness of IDEO is in the front end. Now, once again, we look at the funnel itself, or the system itself, and then I want to show you all 4 elements in practice. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these. I think you can read these and understand a lot of them yourself. And we could talk about that next week in class, but I want you to realize a few things. Let's just offer a handful here. So, for example, the management has opted to have very few titles in this company, meaning you don't have senior VP of product or service development, but rather, they all have the same level, same title. And that is a critical decision, for one, because it affects the culture. So imagine if there were a lot of titles, then people wouldn't feel as psychologically safe. They would not feel that status comes from ideas, but rather from seniority. And you could get these diverse teams together, but the people with, quote, the less sexy titles would tend to defer to the people with the sexier titles. So it noticed that these two fit together very nicely. So you have one affects the other. Failure is accepted is a really big thing at IDEO, and it begs this idea that if you want to be innovative, you have to have a culture, shared cultural value, that it's okay to experiment and fail. A flat organization, that once again fits with the culture of innovation because there are very few layers of management. So the idea, again, if somebody wants to do something, they don't have to go through 12 layers of management to get it approved. So that enables innovative processes. The diverse teams, I think that's one of the really interesting things about the video that you saw. There was a linguist, the gentleman who was supposed to go to med school but dropped out because he's having such a good time at IDEO, the Harvard MBA. So this is a really diverse group of people who've gotten together, and they arguably really do exemplify this idea of what a great team is. Here's one that's rather interesting. There's a short distance between the teams and the prototype shop, which facilitates communication and, that, for that matter, speedy communication, which is important for innovation. Let me pull this apart here. Another one that I would like to note, this is actually really, really important. When you think about the front end of this, and this is one way to connect IDEO with the Innovator's DNA article, you can really build in those 5 innovator skills into or analyze IDEO using those skills. For example, the client anthropology is very much consistent with the idea of observing. That is, observing customers with that product or service in action. In addition, when you think about networking and the DNA, Innovator's DNA, it really gets to this, the idea that creative people have a diverse network of people from whom they gain insight. And so I would urge you to think about these other ones, or the other 3 skills and how they would fit with this. And again, notice that they fit together. This is really, really important in this component or this piece of it, that it matters, that all of them are integrated. Notice that In the beginning here, this is part of the management style. If you remember from the video, the management is very facilitative. The gentleman stands up with his bell and says, don't criticize ideas, but then he wants involvement from people, so he's just a facilitator. But then the management style becomes a bit more, quote, authoritative or directive toward the end, and that is the adults take over, because the idea is you've got a gajillion ideas, but you can't pick all of them. So the adults help enable the funnel, or funneling ideas through the funnel, and spit out, so to speak, few options from which they can develop later. So it's very, very carefully orchestrated. And if you imagine that, for example, all of the management staff was fired and they brought in people who were really more directive to begin with, it would undermine this culture. People would be less playful. They would feel like they didn't necessarily have the trust and respect of each other. They might not feel like they could ask for forgiveness, not permission. Maybe they'd feel like they have to ask for permission because the management style is much more directive and hands-on. So this is a very carefully crafted system. And I encourage you to think about it in detail. Read these closely. Now, to tell you what they ultimately did. Ultimately, Boyle accepted the Handspring offer on the shortened schedule because they had a really good relationship with Handspring, and to the point I made earlier, the project was viewed as an experiment that could challenge IDEO's system, and maybe could help identify a shorter time to market opportunity. Now, if you notice, the Palm 5 was a huge smashing success in the workplace, and the Visor most people have never heard of. So although both of these are technologically outdated, one was a huge success, one wasn't. So to those people who argued that maybe IDEO should have taken on the Visor as a longer-term project, you might be able to argue that it could have become the product standard if IDEO had just challenged Handspring's timeline. But keep in mind, this is actually a really, really important piece, which is this. David Kelly said what he is good at and what IDEO is good at is creating the platform on which products and services are developed time and time again. So why not experiment with the system itself? This is a really, really interesting opportunity, which tells you that to be a learning organization, you constantly have to be challenging yourselves and taking on risks, and that's exactly what they did. By the way, the shopping cart was not commercialized. The folks at IDEO decided they undertook it it was too speedy a process, and in fact they didn't really have a client beyond the network that they were working with to sell these shopping carts to. So let me check our time here. Okay, so let me just end with this as our last video. They deliver breakthrough products again and again because it's got a system, and it is willing to play and continuously experiment with that system. And I'll offer the other two rules next class, but for now what I would say is the idea is that you organize through prototypes, which gives you a lot of feedback at the onset of the process before you make any mistakes. So notice the rough, rapid, and right idea. They do lots of prototypes, and they try to get part of what they need right, and they do that early on in order to get feedback from customers. So with that in mind, I'm going to pause there, and I look forward to seeing you next week, and we'll talk about this a little bit more then.